Hello, my dear friends. I welcome you to my channel. Today, we are going to discuss fundamental rights. This topic is very important to you because we have been discussing rights and duties since ages. As a responsible citizen, if I do not know what are the fundamental rights granted to the citizens, to the brothers and sisters in my society, how shall I come to know what are my duties? Correct? So please do not look into the rights and the privileges from your point of view, but please understand there is a combination between the rights and duties. So if you are more emphasized on the duties, of course you can be a better citizen and a more responsible citizen in this society. But let us start a discussion on fundamental rights. So whenever I talk about the fundamental rights, one question that comes into my mind is, why do we call such rights fundamental rights? So please understand what is the reason behind this. The rights, the certain privileges which are granted to the citizens are known as fundamental in the nature because without which the citizens cannot survive. There are basic requirements, certain basic privileges which I need to be to survive as a citizen in the society. That is the reason we call them fundamental rights. Now, one thing that can come into your mind: how did this concept originate into this world? Okay, let us go back to the history. I would like to discuss with you the first document on fundamental rights came into existence in 1215, 1215. And who was the ruler at that time? King John, who was the ruler in India in 1215, issued the first document on privileges or the rights. And this document came to be known as Magna Carta. So, in short, I can say that Magna Carta was the first document on the privileges which were to be granted to the citizens, which came into existence in 1215 and it was issued by King John. And later on, this concept was borrowed by the Americans. So, American Constitution mentioned such rights under the heading of Bill of Rights. And when Indian Constitution framers borrowed this concept, the title was changed, and the Bill of Rights in America came to be known as Fundamental Rights in India. So let us understand what does it mean by and what are the fundamental rights granted to the citizens. One question that may be coming into mind is: are fundamental rights granted to the citizens only? No, there are few fundamental rights which are granted not only to the citizens but also to the non-citizens. That means if someone visits India, suppose comes from Australia or any other country, then certain fundamental rights are granted to them as well. But we have to look into which fundamental rights are granted. Are fundamental rights granted, which we are talking about, are they granted to all the citizens of the other countries? No. There we will look into what is the meaning of enemy aliens and friendly aliens, correct? So that means we have to understand those concepts, then only we will understand which are the rights to be granted to the non-citizens and what are the further categorization in this regard. But right now we will look into the rights which are granted to the citizens, correct? So if I talk about the Constitution of India, the concept of, as I said earlier, this concept was borrowed from American Constitution where it was mentioned as Bill of Rights, which came to be known as Fundamental Rights in Indian Constitution. So Fundamental Rights is basically the third chapter. If I talk about the beginning of the Constitution of India, the first chapter talks about India and its territory from Articles 1 to 4, and the second chapter is on citizenship from Articles 5 to 11. So whenever I talk about the fundamental rights, the articles which covers third chapter, which actually mentions the fundamental rights, they start from 12 and they end at 35. So that means Articles 12 to 35, Part 3 talks about the fundamental rights. One question that comes into the mind: are we calling them fundamental rights? Yes, we are calling them fundamental rights because without such privileges and the rights, it would become very difficult, rather terribly difficult for the citizens to survive in the society. Correct? Now, the question is: how many fundamental rights are granted to the citizens? If I say how many fundamental rights are granted to the citizens, I would certainly say six. But you may be wondering why I have mentioned seven fundamental rights. I have mentioned seven fundamental rights so that you become aware when the Constitution was implemented. The Constitution mentioned seven fundamental rights in those days, but sixth fundamental right, which was right to property under Article 31, it was repealed. It was repealed through an amendment. This was an amendment, what I've called 44th Amendment Act 1978. So this was an amendment which made right to property, which declared it as a legal right. So that means it was removed from the list of the fundamental rights and it became a legal right. So where it is mentioned now, it is mentioned in part, I would say 12, part 12, article 300A. So that means it is now legal right. So the question that will be coming into your mind, what is the difference between legal right and what is how legal rights are different from fundamental rights? We shall be discussing such technical aspects in the upcoming videos because it's a vast topic. I will take nearly 4 to 5 videos to cover the whole topic on fundamental rights. Let us briefly discuss what are the fundamental rights which are mentioned in our constitution. The first fundamental right here is right to equality. Right to equality, which covers Article 14 to 18. So that means if we talk about right to equality, when I talk about no discrimination on the basis of caste, color, creed, gender, and place of birth, so they are actually mentioned in Article 15. So if I say equal opportunities, equal career opportunities in public employment, that means Article 16. So such fundamental rights are mentioned under the heading of right to equality. So that means there are further more provisions, more articles which are mentioned under one fundamental right. So okay. So what I said, the first fundamental right here is right to equality from Article 14 to 18. And second fundamental right here is right to freedom, which covers articles from 19 to 22. If you must have heard an article which is very commonly discussed in the newspapers, that is right to speech. Correct? Right to speech, right to assembly, right to association. So such words, such privileges are granted under Article 19. So that means that fundamental right falls under the title of right to freedom. Right to freedom covers articles from 19 to 20. When the third fundamental right here is right against exploitation. And it covers two articles, Article 23 and 24. You must have heard about the exploitation when certain people are exploited in the society. So, in what way that they can be protected as per the provisions which are mentioned in our constitution? In fact, no one can exploit others. So, the main problem is everyone is not aware about such things. It's a right with you that no one can exploit you. Correct? Next, fourth fundamental right here is right to freedom of religion. So, right to freedom of religion covers articles from 25 to 28. We shall be discussing such rights in depth in the upcoming sessions. But in this session, I just want you to introduce the fundamental rights so that you have basic idea what do we understand by fundamental rights, what are the fundamental rights, and I'm just discussing few important and other significant rights which are mentioned under these rights. Correct? So next fundamental right here is cultural and education rights. This is basically the right granted to the minorities and it covers two articles, Article 29 and 30. And next fundamental right, which is not there in existence right now, this has become a legal right and it is mentioned under Article 300A right now. Correct? So this is right to property. That means it was a fundamental right, but it is a legal right right now. So if it is a legal right, so that means out of seven, so there are six fundamental rights which are granted to the citizens as on date. Then, so the last fundamental right here is right to constitutional remedies, Article 32. This right is very important. If someone violates my fundamental right, approaching Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights is itself given to me as a fundamental right under Article 32. The question is then how Article 32 and Article 226 are linked with each other. Article 32 talks about the approach that an individual can approach the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights, but it depends, everyone may not be able to approach Supreme Court. In case a person, a citizen wants to approach the High Court of the state, there's a possibility and such permission is granted under Article 226. So Article 226 allows for the enforcement of the fundamental rights if any of your fundamental rights is violated by an individual in the society. I hope you must have understood the basic information which I have shared with you on fundamental rights, correct? Two things that we have to understand here is, are fundamental rights positive or negative? They seem to be positive from your point of view because you are the citizens, but they're considered to be negative in the nature because they put certain restrictions on the state. That means states cannot make such laws, those laws which can violate your fundamental rights. They are considered to be the negative from the state's point of view because they put restrictions on that. Second most important thing that we should understand, whether fundamental rights are absolute or not. Please understand that the fundamental rights are not absolute. So that means the fundamental rights can be suspended anytime. But there are two fundamental rights which can never be suspended. The rights which are mentioned in Article 20 and Article 21. 21 is very important because right to life. In no situation, in no situation anyone can come and violate your Article 21. That means right to life. Correct? So fundamental rights are not absolute. They are subject to certain restrictions which can be imposed. Certain fundamental rights can be discontinued at any time, but two fundamental rights can never be violated. They can never be, what I can say, there are only two fundamental rights which are absolute. That means they cannot be suspended in any sort of the situation. What I said, are rights under mentioned Article 20 and 21. Then one more thing, our fundamental rights are justiciable. Yes, they are justiciable. So if someone violates any one of your fundamental rights, you have an authority to approach Supreme Court under Article 32 and High Court under Article 226 for the enforcement of the fundamental rights. I hope you must have enjoyed this session. In this session, I would request you, if you like this session, you must like the video and please share it and subscribe the channel so that the information that I have shared with you can be productive and may match the requirements of the others in the society. Thank you. Thanks a lot, my dear friends. Goodbye.